We have arrived. Today you'll be making your first project with me, which will be a satin pillowcase. For those of you who are just joining me for the tutorial, welcome. My name is Kimberly Dre, and this is my sewing class. I've structured my videos as a step-by-step course in which I will introduce new concepts every video, building on previous skills. So if you want to learn with me, start with the first video until you get to this point. I've included the fabric measurements that you're going to need for today's project down below, but there are several sets of measurements, one for a standard size pillowcase, two for a king size pillowcase, and then I'm going to show you two different styles of pillowcase hem, and you're going to have to determine which style you would prefer. And there will be a different measurement depending on which style you choose. I really debated over whether to do satin pillowcases as a first project or not, mainly because satin as a fabric presents a bit of a challenge in that it is slippery. Cotton pillowcases are so much easier. And if you have any reservations about the project today whatsoever, I would recommend getting a cotton fabric rather than a satin fabric. That being said, satin pillowcases are so fashionable and they are so comfortable, and I figured you would want one. So I overcame my reservations about it, and we're just gonna push through, and I'm gonna show you how to sew on this slippery satin fabric. I'll be introducing three new concepts in today's video. Number one, how to finish off a raw edge. Number two, how to pin your fabric. And number three, how to top stitch. So let's sew a satin pillowcase.
First, you'll need to thread your machine, but make sure you choose a thread that will perfectly match the fabric you're sewing on, as today's project will have top stitching. That means your stitching will show, and you want to find something that's as invisible as possible. Note that not all whites are equal. They are different colors, and you need to find a thread that matches. Let's talk about satin. It's two things: it's slippery and it frays easily. Before you do anything else with satin, you need to take care of the fraying edges. This is a good step to do no matter what fabric you're sewing on, but it's not as vital on cotton. On a satin like this, you have to stop the fray. If you have a serger, you're set, and it makes a stitch like this one. But without a serger, what you need is a zigzag stitch. On your machine stitch selector knob, you'll see several Z-like stitches. Some of them are for making buttonholes, but others are for finishing off fabric edges. The one you want for finishing off a fabric edge is number 4. Turn your knob until number 4 is at the top next to the raised dot. Lift your presser foot, slide your fabric underneath, matching the fabric to the very inside edge of the presser foot, with the bulk of the fabric to the left. Bury your needle, drop the presser foot. Now sew around all edges of your pre-cut piece of satin fabric. And don't forget to turn the corners like I showed you in the last video. Once that's done, your pillowcase will be free of fraying and be a quality item that won't come apart easily. It's true, I have skipped this step in the past, but never for something I have sewn professionally. Your open seams need to be finished off if you want a quality professional looking item. It's a professional standard, it's a quality feature, and you shouldn't skip it.
Now you'll need that piece of fabric that you just finished off the edges with your zigzag stitch, and you'll want to fold it in half and then go grab your pins.
Before I forget, turn your stitch selector knob back to number 8 for the rest of the project. You may have noticed when sewing your fabric in the last video, when you're sewing two pieces of fabric together, it tends to shift and slide around as you're sewing. But if it does that when you're sewing on this pillowcase, you could end up with the fabric not matching, and it could create a pretty weird looking pillowcase. The solution to this is pins. With the fold at the bottom, you'll be pinning up one short side of the fabric and the long side of the fabric as shown. Remembering to have right sides together, pinning is a rather straightforward process. Go down in the fabric and then come back up. Make sure your pins are facing up, not down. Pin close to the edge, but it doesn't have to be right on the edge. A good rule of thumb for basically straight seams would be 2 to 4 inches apart between each pin. Keep working until the short side and long side of your piece is fully pinned, and then I would place your pin pad or pin cushion on the right side of your sewing machine so you have a place to put your pins as you're sewing. When you've finished pinning your piece, lift your presser foot and slide the pinned short side in the corner of the fold under your sewing machine at the 1/2 inch seam allowance marked line. Bury your needle and drop the presser foot to prepare to sew a seam. Depress the foot pedal and remember to do a small reverse stitch at the top to seal off the seam. You'll be removing pins with your right hand as you sew. It takes a little practice, but you'll get used to it. In the beginning, you'll probably want to stop your machine to pull out the pin, but later on, you can almost anticipate the pin before it comes and take it out as you're sewing. It won't ruin your machine to sew over a pin, but it's not generally desirable as it's possible to break a needle if your needle were to hit the pin directly. You may notice as you're sewing that satin is a rather slippery material. Go slowly and continue to nudge it in the right direction and slide it back into place if necessary. As long as your needle is buried, you should be able to make adjustments as you go to make sure that the fabric isn't slipping too far and that you're keeping your seam straight. When you get to within 1/2 inch of the end of the short side, with the needle buried, lift the presser foot, rotate the fabric, turn the corner, and sew the long side. To sew straight, make sure that your fabric is aligned with the 1/2 inch mark on the needle plate. Keep sewing until you reach the end. Make sure to do a reverse stitch and then lift the presser foot, release the fabric, and clip your thread tails. Now, bring your finished fabric to the ironing board and press open your seams. This is another quality feature you should get in the habit of doing because it's a professional standard. I see so many projects ruined because people try to skip this step, but you won't. You will now need a sewing gauge to measure your hem. I'm going to show you 2 hem styles, one that uses less fabric and has a lighter hem, and the other is a heavier hem using more fabric, and you'll have to decide which you prefer. My usual preference is a thick hem. It's so luxurious, but I think a thin hem for a thin pillowcase like a satin pillowcase is also so beautiful. For the lighter version, pull the pillowcase onto the ironing board wrong side out. That means you should be able to see the seam you just sewed. Now take the sewing gauge and measure down 1/2 inch, and you're going to press 1/2 inch down towards the seam you just sewed all the way around the pillowcase. When that's complete, you're going to fold it over again 4 inches and do the same thing 4 inches down. using the sewing gauge to help you with the measurement. Now what you have is a pressed hem. For the heavier hem style, pull the pillowcase onto the ironing board wrong side out and press down 4 inches using the sewing gauge to help you measure. Return that pressed hem to the ironing board and double it over another 4 inches using the sewing gauge to make sure you're measuring properly. And now you have a pressed hem. Pin your pressed hem all the way around, taking care not to pin through both sides of the pillowcase at once. What you're about to do is a version of something called a top stitch. We'll talk more about it in the future, but just know that a top stitch is a stitch you'll see. It's not hidden like a seam. You will see these stitches. Before attempting this, you should remove your free arm. It will make the fabric so much easier to manage. You'll want this stitch to be rather close to the edge where you pinned, so I recommend using the inside oval of the presser foot as your guide. You want to be sewing about 1/8 of an inch or closer from the edge of the fold. Lift the foot, slide the fabric underneath, bury the needle, drop the presser foot, and depress the foot pedal. Sew slowly and carefully, making sure the fabric is feeding as evenly as possible. This can be a challenge with sewing pillowcases. You'll often find the top fabric stretching a bit. I try to go very slowly to make sure I'm not leaving extra fabric from pin to pin. Sometimes, especially with satin, you have to kind of work the fabric in. Push it a bit as you're working or stop completely and readjust the fabric as you go to make sure your fabric is matching up from one pin to the next. Don't be afraid to use a seam ripper if you get off track. Every sewist has to pick out seams eventually, and if you don't like what you've done and there's a mistake, don't be afraid at all to get your seam ripper and pick those stitches out one by one so you can try again. When you get all the way around, reverse stitch and clip your thread tails.
Now that you've sewn your seams and you've pressed open your seams and you've turned over your hem and top stitched your hem, all you have to do is turn it inside out, and here you go. You have a pillowcase. With the 7th video finished, that's a wrap. And I hope that for Christmas you found plenty of things wrapped underneath your tree, including a sewing machine. And that'll help you to sleep in heavenly peace. From here on out, I'll be giving you one video every month or two just to build on the skills that we've already established here and get you started on the next sewing adventure. Those adventures are going to include key fobs, lanyards, pencil pouches, notebook covers, beach towel backpacks, lunch bags. It's going to be so much fun. Stick around and I'll see you next video.